A young woman stood in the frozen mud as a man in a fine coat told her father she was no longer his daughter. She had become a payment. One scarred stranger changed everything with a single pouch of gold. Yet what he asked for in return was something no one in that valley could have foreseen. This is the story of Clara Mercer, sold into the wilderness, carried into the mountains, and forged by winter into something neither she nor the man who saved her had ever imagined. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels. The first thing Clara noticed when Victor Langford rode onto the Mercer property was how clean his boots were. It was a strange thing to notice. The road from town was half frozen mud, rutted with wagon tracks, and half buried in the early sleet that had been falling since before dawn. Every man who worked this land, every farmer, every hired hand, every traveler passing through, arrived with dirty boots. It was the price of living on the frontier. You were always covered in something. But Langford's boots were spotless, black leather, polished to a mirror finish, dry as a drawing room floor. He rode a gray gelding worth more than the Mercer farm had earned in years combined, and he sat in the saddle the way wealthy men always sat. Like the horse existed for his convenience, and the world existed for his pleasure. Behind him came two men on darker horses. They weren't ranch hands. Ranch hands carried tools. These men carried revolvers on both hips and wore the flat, indifferent expressions of people who had done ugly things before and expected to do them again before supper. Clara was standing on the porch when they rode up. She had a bucket of well water in each hand and mud on her skirts from the garden she'd been trying to salvage before the ground froze solid for winter. She set the buckets down slowly, carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to make noise. Her father came out from behind her a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag that was too dirty to clean anything. Henry Mercer looked far older than his years. The drought had done that. Summers without rain, locust swarms that had stripped the fields down to bare dirt, and one brutal winter that killed half their livestock had aged him in the span of time that should have been the most productive of his life. His shoulders were rounded now in a way they hadn't been when Clara was small. His eyes had a quality she had no good word for. Not quite defeated, not quite hopeful. Something in between that was somehow worse than either. He recognized Langford before the man had even dismounted. She could tell by the way her father's jaw tightened. "Mr. Langford," Henry said. His voice came out steadier than Clara expected. "Wasn't expecting you so soon. Plans change." Langford swung down from the saddle with practiced ease. He didn't hand the reins to anyone. He just dropped them, and the gelding stood still like it knew better than to move. "Besides, Henry, you and I both know more time wouldn't have made a difference." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Even from the porch, Clara could see the official seals pressed into the paper, the thick legal script running across the page like a sentence being read at trial. "The full amount, including the interest that accrued last month," Langford said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet of the frozen yard carried everything perfectly. "I've been generous, Henry. More generous than most men in my position would be, but there are limits." Henry took the document. His hands didn't shake, which Clara thought was its own kind of bravery. He read it, or pretended to read it, because she knew her father well enough to know his eyes were moving, without seeing anything. "I need more time," Henry said. "You've had extensions already. The harvest wasn't a harvest." Langford said it flatly, without cruelty, which made it somehow worse. "Henry, you've got rocks and mud on this property. Whatever was worth growing here stopped growing years ago, and you know it. This isn't a farm anymore. It's a det shaped like a farm. One of the riders behind him shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked. The sound was very loud in the silence. Clara's hands curled around the porch railing. "There has to be something," Henry said. His voice finally cracked, just slightly, like a board bending before it breaks. "Something we can work out. Give me until the season changes. I'll sell the mules. The mules aren't worth much combined." Langford folded the document and tucked it back into his coat. He looked at the farmhouse, then at the barn, then at the frozen garden, taking inventory the way a man looks at something he already owns. "The land is worth something. Not much, but something. I can recoup a portion of my losses if I sell it quickly." He paused. "There is one alternative." Henry went very still. Langford turned his eyes to the porch, and Clara understood, in the space of one breath, exactly what kind of alternative it was going to be. Not because she was naive about the world, because she had never been naive about it at all. She was a woman on the frontier, and women on the frontier learned early what it meant when men with power looked at them as part of a calculation. "Your daughter," Langford said. He said it the same way he might say your barn or your mules. Matter of fact, like a ledger entry. "She's in good health by the look of her. I have an associate in Cheyenne who runs a boarding house, respectable establishment, good pay, all above board. A domestic arrangement. Years of service would satisfy the debt in full and leave a small sum left over for your family besides." The silence that followed was total. Henry didn't move. "A boarding house," Henry said finally. "That's right. In Cheyenne?" "Yes." Clara came down off the porch. She didn't plan it. Her feet just moved, carrying her across the frozen mud toward her father and the man with the clean boots. She stopped beside Henry and looked at Langford directly, which she could tell surprised him. Women on the frontier learn not to look men like him directly. It was considered impertinent. She had never much cared about that. "I know what boarding houses in Cheyenne are," she said. Langford met her gaze. Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment exactly, more like mild irritation at being understood. "Miss Mercer, I know what they are," she said again. "And you know what they are. And you're asking my father to sell me to one." She felt her voice going flat and cold, the way it went when she was frightened enough that the fear burned through and came out the other side as something else. "So, say what you're actually saying, Mr. Langford, or ride off our property." One of the riders behind him made a low sound in his throat. Not a laugh, something harder. Langford looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Henry. "You have until sundown," he said. Then they turned and left. They stood in the kitchen. Henry sat at the table. Clara stood at the window with her arms crossed, staring at the yard where Langford's two men had dismounted and were now leaning against the fence post with the patient, unhurried posture of men who had no doubt about how the day was going to end. "Papa," she said, "don't." Henry pressed his palms flat against the tabletop. "Clara, don't. I'm not going to Cheyenne." "I know. Then we need to figure out what we're actually going to do." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sleet had turned to a dry, fine snow that wasn't sticking yet, but would be by nightfall. "We could run. They'd follow us, and we've got nowhere to go. Your aunt's in Iowa. We'd never make it before winter, not with the mules in the shape they're in." She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. There has to be another way, but she already knew there wasn't. That was the reality of debt on the frontier. It wasn't like owing a neighbor a favor or borrowing seed corn from a friend. Langford's kind of debt was a machine. It ground down everything it touched until there was nothing left but the grinding. She had watched it happen to the Harmon family in recent years, and the Pressler family the year before that. Land seized, family scattered, lives folded up like bad cards. She just hadn't believed it would happen to them. That was the thing about believing you were different. It felt true right up until it wasn't. She was about to turn back to her father and say something. She didn't know what. Just something, because the silence was unbearable, when she heard a sound from the yard. Not from the direction of the road. From the north. From the tree line. She looked up. The rider came out of the pine forest at the edge of the property like something the wilderness had decided to expel. A massive horse. A dun stallion. Thick-muscled and heavy-footed, breathing clouds of steam in the cold air, picking its way through the frozen grass at the field's edge. Beside it, on a lead rope, walked a loaded mule carrying crates and canvas bundles roped tight against the weather. And the man in the saddle, Clara's first impression, was big. Not tall the way some men were tall, a thin, stretched kind of tall that looked precarious. This was something different. He was built like the landscape he'd come out of, wide through the shoulders and the chest, wrapped in layers of fur and heavy wool that made him look even larger than he probably was. A broad-brimmed hat, dark with old water stains, sat low over his face. A beard, dark and thick, covered most of what the hat didn't. Long, dark hair fell past his collar. He rode with the particular stillness of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, not rigid, but settled, like a man who had made peace with being exactly where he was in any given moment. One of Langford's men straightened up off the fence post and put a hand near his revolver. The rider didn't react. He just kept coming at the same pace, unhurried, until he pulled up his horse about 20 feet from Langford's gelding. He sat there a moment, looking at the scene in the yard. The two armed men, the fancy horse, the document that Langford had produced again, and was now holding in one hand like a flag. Then the rider swung down from the saddle. He was taller than Clara had expected, and when the hat brim came up and she could finally see his face, she felt a cold shift somewhere in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The left side of his face was scarred. Not a small scar, something old and severe that ran from his cheekbone down toward his jaw, silvery white against his weathered skin. The kind of mark that could only come from a fire, or something equally unforgiving. It wasn't hideous. She'd seen worse. But it was stark. It made his face impossible to look at. Casually. Your eyes went to it automatically, the way they went to a lightning strike across a summer sky. He studied Langford for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than she expected, low and rough, but not loud, "What's the debt?" Langford blinked. "I beg your pardon? The debt?" The man nodded toward the document. "On this property, what's the number?" Langford looked at him the way wealthy men look at things that are confusing them, with an expression that couldn't decide whether to be offended or simply puzzled. "That's a private matter between myself and Henry Mercer," Henry said from behind Clara. She turned. Her father had come to the doorway. He was looking at the rider with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's the amount." The scarred man reached inside his coat. He produced a leather pouch, heavy enough that it sagged in his grip. He crossed the yard without hurrying, stopped in front of Langford, and dropped the pouch at the man's polished feet. The sound it made was dense and definitive. "Gold," the man said. "Enough to cover the debt and the interest both. You can have someone weigh it in town if you want to argue about it, but it's all there." Langford looked at the pouch on the ground. He looked up at the scarred man. Something complicated was happening behind his eyes. "Who are you?" Langford asked. "Asher Boone." He said it without particular emphasis, like stating a weather condition. "I trap. I work the Bitterroots mostly. Used to work further south." A pause. "Pick up the gold, Mr. Langford. We're done here." Langford didn't move immediately. He glanced at his two men. One of them shrugged almost imperceptibly. The other kept his hand near his revolver, but didn't draw it, clearly calculating something he didn't quite like the math of. Because the thing Clara was only now noticing was that Asher Boone wasn't unarmed. He had a long rifle across his back, the kind of heavy-barreled plains rifle that serious hunters used for serious work. And at his hip, a Colt revolver that looked old and worn, and very well used. The kind of worn that meant something different from neglect. Tools wore that way. Weapons worn by men who actually used them were that way. Langford picked up the gold. "This resolves the debt," he said. His voice had tightened slightly like a string being wound past its comfortable tension. "But it doesn't address the property." "The property belongs to Henry Mercer," Asher said. "His deed, his land. Unless you've got a document that says otherwise, I suggest you ride back to wherever you came from. I have every legal right to collect a debt, which is now paid." Asher turned his back on Langford deliberately, unhurriedly, and looked at Henry Mercer. "Sir, I'd like a word with you." Langford said nothing. His jaw was set hard. After a long moment, he made a small gesture to his men and walked to his horse. He mounted with careful, controlled movements. Clara watched him the whole time, and just before he turned the gelding toward the road, his eyes found her face. They stayed there for a moment, cold and flat and very patient. Then he rode away. Henry Mercer owed a debt, and debts on the frontier didn't disappear just because the money changed hands. Asher Boone understood that before he even rode onto the property. He had been watching from the tree line for some time, because men like Langford didn't just show up without scouts. And Asher had spent too many years in the wilderness to approach any situation without first understanding the shape of it. He'd known Henry Mercer would say yes. Men with no options always said yes. That was the brutal arithmetic of desperation. What he hadn't been certain about was how the girl would react. He stood in the Mercer kitchen with his hat in his hands, which felt wrong. The hat was wet from the snow, and he was dripping on the woman's clean floor. But taking it off was the thing you did when you were asking something of someone, and he was asking something. Henry sat across from him at the table. The girl, Clara, stood near the stove with her arms crossed and an expression that could have stopped a river. "I'll say it plain," Asher said, "because there was no good way to say it that wasn't plain. I paid your debt. That makes me your creditor now, in a legal sense, though I have no interest in that arrangement. I'm not Langford." "No?" Henry said. "You're not, but I'm asking something in return." He kept his eyes on Henry, because this was between him and the father for now, even if it would fall hardest on the daughter. "I need a wife." The kitchen was very quiet. "I need a wife," he said again, "because I'm heading back into the Bitterroots before the passes close for winter. I'm going in for the season. I've got a cabin up there, permanent. Good structure, well supplied." He paused. "I've been up there alone for the previous winters. I'm a man who's lived rough, and I've got more gold up in those mountains than I know what to do with. And I'm asking for a wife to come with me. Someone who'd want to, who'd choose to make a life up there, for real, not just for the winter." Henry looked at him for a long time. The lines on his face deepened. "You're asking me to give you my daughter. I'm asking if she's willing." Asher looked up and met Clara's eyes directly for the first time. They were dark brown, sharp, and absolutely furious. "I'm not interested in something she doesn't choose herself. I want to be clear about that." "You have a strange way of giving someone a choice," Clara said. Her voice was level, controlled. You could hear the effort that control was costing her. "You show up, pay off our debt, and now my father has to decide between owing you the money or handing me over. How exactly is that a choice?" "It's not a perfect one," he said. "I know that. It's barely a choice at all." "I know that too." She stared at him. He held it. He'd learned a long time ago that looking away from things didn't make them smaller. "I'm not a good man," he said. It came out more honest than he intended, but honest was all he had right now, and probably all he'd ever had. "I've lived rough my whole life, and I expect I'll die rough. I don't know how to be easy company. I don't talk much. I've got a temper when things go wrong, and I know it. But I won't hurt you. I won't touch you unless you want it. I won't treat you like property." He paused. "That's not what I want from this." "Then what do you want from it?" she asked. He thought about lying. Something smoother. Something easier. He thought about it and decided he was too old and too tired for it. "Someone there," he said. "That's all. Someone there when winter gets long." They were married by the Justice of the Peace in Granger Creek the following morning. Clara in her best dress, and Asher in the cleanest shirt he owned, which wasn't very clean. The JP asked the necessary questions. They answered them. Papers were signed. Clara's father held her for a long time before she climbed onto the mule Asher had brought for her. She could feel him shaking. Not quite crying, but close enough that it didn't matter. "You come down from those mountains if you need to," he said. His voice was very rough. "You hear me? You come down." "I hear you, Papa." "And if he hurts you, he won't?" She said it without knowing whether she believed it. She said it because her father needed her to say it, and because the alternative, standing there in the frozen mud and agreeing that yes, her husband of mere minutes might very well hurt her, and yes, she was riding into the mountains with him anyway, was a truth too raw to hand to a man who already looked like he was carrying more weight than was fair. She kissed his cheek. Then she climbed up on the mule and rode after Asher Boone, who had already started north without looking back. The first stretch of riding was silence, not comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who know each other well enough to not need to talk. This was the other kind, the kind that has edges. Asher rode ahead on his dun stallion, the mule on a lead behind him. And Clara rode her own mule behind that, watching his broad back and trying to figure out what she had just done to herself. The land north of Granger Creek turned rough within a few miles. The flat, dry farmland broke apart into rising ground, then into proper hills, dense with pine and bare-limbed aspen, then into the first real slopes of the mountain country. The temperature dropped as they climbed. Her breath became visible. She dressed as warmly as she had. 2 wool skirts, a heavy coat, her boots stuffed with extra wool wrapped in cloth. But the cold here had a different quality than the cold of the valley. It was intentional, somehow, specific. It pressed against her face and hands like it was checking her. After some time, Asher pulled up on a ridge that looked out over the valley they'd left behind. He didn't say anything. He just sat there for a moment. Clara pulled her mule up beside him and looked back, too. The Mercer homestead was invisible from here, swallowed by the gray distance. All she could see was the broad, flat expanse of the valley, the distant silver thread of the creek, the gray-brown smear of Granger Creek town, with its smoke rising in thin lines against the low sky. She thought about her father sitting at that table. She thought about Langford's boots. "We'll camp further north," Asher said. His voice startled her. She'd half forgotten he could speak. "Ground's going to get rougher. You all right on that mule?" "Fine," she said. A pause. "You can tell me if you're not," he said. "I'm not going to think less of you for it." "I said I'm fine." He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd expected and turned his horse north. She followed. The camp he made that first night was better than she expected, and worse than she'd hoped. A natural hollow in the hillside sheltered from the wind. A fire built small and hot the way wilderness men built them, not for show, but for function. He strung a canvas between 2 pines and arranged the bedding from one of the packs underneath it. Then he spread his own bedroll on the other side of the fire. She watched him do it. She'd been braced for something, a moment of confrontation, a testing of the arrangement, some assertion of whatever rights a man in his position might think he had. The bracing had been exhausting. That constant held-breath vigilance, when he just lay down on his side of the fire and pulled his coat over himself and said, "Good night." In the direction of the flames, she stood there for a moment, feeling something she couldn't quite identify. Then she went to her bedroll and lay down. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them, wind moved through the pine tops with a sound like breathing. She lay on her back and stared up at the canvas above her and listened to the wilderness settling in around them. He was already asleep, she thought, or pretending to be, which amounted to the same thing. She was not asleep for a very long time. In the days that followed, as they journeyed deeper into the mountains, she had learned a few things about Asher Boone. He woke before dawn, every dawn, and had water boiled and food started before full light. He didn't eat much. He ate efficiently, the way men who'd gone hungry ate, with attention and without waste. He tracked weather through some combination of observation and intuition that she didn't understand yet, reading the sky and the wind with the focused expression of someone reading a letter with bad news in it. He never talked about himself. She tried once, on the second morning, to ask him something ordinary. Where he'd grown up, whether he'd always been in the mountains. And he'd answered in few words and a half gesture, and then gone back to checking the mule's harness. It wasn't rudeness exactly. It was more like the conversational equivalent of a door that was closed but not locked. She could feel the distinction even if she couldn't explain it. What he did instead of talking was watch. She noticed that. He watched everything. The sky, the terrain, the tree line, the animals. And he watched her. Though never in a way that felt threatening, more the way he watched the weather, like gathering information, like trying to understand a thing that mattered. As they traveled deeper, they hit real snow. Not the fine, dry dusting of the lower elevations, but proper mountain snow. Deep and heavy, muffling sound, and turning the forest into a strange, still cathedral. The horses moved through it with difficulty, and Asher dismounted to check the footing ahead before leading them through. He didn't ask her if she needed help. The first time she managed. The second time her mule slid sideways in a hidden drift, and she went off the saddle and into the snow hard, landing on her hip and her hand. She sat up spitting snow and cold, and something she was going to pretend was just frustration. When she looked up, Asher was standing over her with his hand out. She took it. He pulled her up with almost no effort, like she weighed nothing. Up close, closer than they'd been since the JP's office, she could see his eyes properly for the first time. She'd been avoiding it, she realized. His eyes were dark gray, and they had lines around them that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weather and worry. Looking at her now, with something careful and attentive that she was not yet ready to call kind. "Hurt?" he said. "My dignity, mostly." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was a thing in the neighborhood of a smile. "Snow gets deeper above the next ridge," he said. "You tell me when you need to stop." "I'll tell you when I need to stop," she agreed. He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned and went back to the horse. She stood in the snow for a moment, one hand still tingling from where his had been. Then she brushed herself off and climbed back on the mule. The cabin appeared as they reached the high country, emerging from the pines along the edge of a frozen alpine lake, like it had grown there rather than been built. It was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure, even now, what she had expected. Something mean and dark, she supposed. Some grim little shelter suitable for a man who lived alone in the wilderness. But the cabin was substantial, solid, built from felled timber, chinked tight with moss and clay. A stone chimney rising from one end, a proper window on the south wall, a covered porch, a stable built off the back, larger than it needed to be for just a horse and a mule. Asher opened the door and stood back to let her go in first. She stepped through. The interior smelled like wood smoke and pine sap, and something else she couldn't name, something that was just the smell of a place where one person had lived alone for a long time. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove with a flat iron top, a bed built against the north wall with a thick mattress of what looked like horsehair and wool, shelves lined with supplies, flour, dried meat, salt, canned goods, books. She hadn't expected books. A rifle hung on the wall beside the window. Everything was clean. Everything was placed with a precision that looked almost compulsive, the precision of a man who had no one to blame but himself if something was out of order. She turned a slow circle, taking it in. Then she looked up at the fireplace mantel. The carving was small, easy to miss. A wooden sparrow, its wings folded, its head tilted at a slight angle like it was listening for something. Carved with obvious care from a piece of the pale wood. Birch, maybe, or something even lighter. Simple. Perfect. Clara went very still. The cabin disappeared around her. The cold disappeared, and the exhaustion and the days of riding and fear and uncertainty, all of it dropped away. Because she knew that sparrow. She knew it the way you know something that bypassed your memory entirely and lived somewhere older and deeper than that. She knew the tilt of the head, the particular set of the wings, the grain of the pale wood. She knew it because she had held one like it in her hands once, a long time ago, on the bank of the Missouri River, shaking with cold and river water. And a boy had put it in her palm and closed her fingers around it and sat with her until the shaking stopped. She had been a child. He had been older. She had never learned his name. She turned around slowly. Asher was still near the door, his hat in his hands, watching her with that careful, attentive look she was beginning to recognize. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath. "You were there," she said, "at the Missouri River. I was a child. I fell through the ice. You pulled me out." He said nothing. "You sat with me until I stopped shaking," she said. "And then you gave me a sparrow like that one." She pointed at the mantel. You were a boy then. You didn't say your name, and then you were gone." The cabin was completely quiet. Asher looked at the sparrow. Then he looked at her. "I thought I imagined you," she said. It came out broken in a way she hadn't intended. "I was a child. I wasn't sure it was real." "It was real," he said quietly. "I kept looking for you," she said. For a long time." She pressed her lips together. "And then I stopped looking." "I know. How long have you known that I was her?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Saw you in Granger Creek some months ago. You were outside the dry goods store with your father." He paused. "I recognized you from when I was younger." "Yes?" She stared at him. "And then Langford started making inquiries about the Mercer property," he said. "I heard about it in Billings. Talk travels in small towns. I heard what he was planning." He stopped, looked at the floor. "So, I came back." The silence stretched. "You spent your gold," she said. "Everything you had. Enough of it for me." He looked up. "Yes." She stood there in the middle of the cabin they were apparently going to share for the winter. In the middle of the mountains. In the middle of a life she hadn't planned, and hadn't chosen, and couldn't quite see the shape of yet. And she looked at this large, scarred, quiet man who had carved a sparrow when he was younger and remembered a drowning girl for many years and ridden down out of the wilderness to stand between her and the worst thing that was waiting for her. She didn't know what to feel. She wasn't sure there was a name for it yet. "I'll take the bed," she said finally. Her voice surprised her. It was steadier than she felt. "You can have the floor near the stove," he nodded. "That's fair." She turned back to the mantel. She looked at the sparrow. "I still have the other one," she said. "The one you gave me. I've carried it for years." He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. She put her bag down on the floor beside the bed and started unpacking. And outside the cabin, the mountain wind picked up through the pines and the snow came down harder than before, beginning the long, slow work of burying the trails behind them. They were sealed in now. The two of them, and the winter and years of something that neither of them had names for yet. The first week in this cabin was the strangest of Clara's life, and she had lived through some strange ones. She woke each morning to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute her family had been making for years, and to the sound of Asher already moving, already awake, already doing the first dozen things that needed doing before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. By the time she dressed and came out from behind the curtain he'd hung across one corner of the cabin for her privacy, there was always food. Not elaborate food, but hot and solid. Cornmeal porridge with salt or dried venison fried in a pan with fat or hardtack softened in broth. He set her portion on the table without comment and ate his own standing near the stove, looking out the south window at the lake and the mountains beyond it. He did this every morning. He never asked if she slept well. He never made conversation for the sake of it. And yet the silence he carried wasn't hostile. It was just the silence of a man who had spent so many years alone that talking required a reason, the way walking required a destination. Clara found it maddening and oddly restful in equal measure. On one morning, she decided she was done being managed. "I want to know what needs doing," she said, while he was pulling on his heavy coat near the door. He stopped. "I handle what needs doing." "I didn't ask you to handle it. I asked you to tell me what it is so I can help handle it." She put her coffee down on the table. "I'm not going to sit in this cabin for the winter and watch you work. I'm not built that way." He looked at her for a moment with that particular look, the weather-reading look. Then he said, "Can you shoot?" "My father had a shotgun. I can fire it." "That's not the same thing as shooting." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. So teach me." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like adjustment. A man recalculating a thing he thought he already understood. "After the wood split," he said, "come out back." She was at the wood pile before he got there. He didn't comment on that either, but she caught the edge of something at his mouth. That almost smile again. There and gone. When he rounded the corner of the cabin and found her already pulling the maul from where it was stuck in the chopping block. "You know how to split wood?" he said. "I grew up on a farm." "Fair enough." He took the maul from her, not rudely, just efficiently, the way experienced people take tools from inexperienced ones, and showed her the technique he used. Where to set the grain, how to let the weight of the head do the work instead of fighting it. She watched carefully. Then she took the maul back and tried it herself. The first few swings were bad. The wood spun off the block and she nearly hit her own boot once. Asher said nothing, just picked up the runaway pieces and reset them on the block without expression. By later swings, she was getting it, the rhythm of it, the way your whole body had to commit to the downstroke or it didn't work. "Better," Asher said. It was the first time he'd offered any assessment of anything she'd done. She filed it away. The shooting lesson came in the afternoon out on the frozen edge of the lake, where the open ground gave him a clear field to work with. He'd brought the Winchester, not his buffalo rifle, not the Colt. The Winchester was a lever-action repeater, lighter than she expected, with a balance that felt almost natural in her hands. "It'll kick," he said. "Less than a shotgun, but respect it." She fired her first shot at a birch tree some distance away and missed. The recoil snapped her shoulder back and she stepped sideways to catch herself. "Lean into it," he said. He was standing behind her and slightly to the right, close enough to correct her, far enough to leave space she hadn't asked him to fill. "Before you fire, put your weight forward, not back. The gun's going to try to push you. You push first. She reset, fired again. This one clipped the birch tree. She heard the wood crack. Again, he said. She fired more times. By the later shots, she was hitting the tree deliberately. Not the center, not reliably, but deliberately. There was a difference between getting lucky with a firearm and actually beginning to understand one, and she could feel herself crossing that line with each shot. When the magazine was empty, Asher was quiet for a moment. "You listen well," he said finally. She lowered the rifle. "Did you expect me not to?" "Didn't know what to expect," he said. Honest, at least. She turned and handed the Winchester back to him. He was closer than she'd realized, and for a moment they were standing with perhaps a few feet between them, the gun passing from her hands to his, both of them holding it briefly at once before he took its full weight. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and turned back toward the cabin. She stood on the frozen lake shore for a moment, listening to the absolute silence of the high country. No wind right now, no birds, just the enormous quiet of altitude and snowpack and distance from everything human, and breathed it in. It was a strange thing, that silence. It had weight. It pressed against your ears in a way that city people probably found terrifying, but she was beginning to understand it differently. There was nothing hiding in it. Everything dangerous in this landscape announced itself. The silence meant nothing was wrong right now. That was, she thought, more than she'd been able to say about most of the silences in her life. The days developed a structure. It was Asher's structure first. She mapped herself onto it the way you map yourself onto a river's current, not fighting it, but finding your place in it. Mornings, fire, food, water hauled from the lake through a hole Asher kept cut in the ice. Mid-mornings, whatever needed maintaining. Wood, harnesses, the cabin itself, which required constant small attention in this cold. Afternoons, he checked his trap lines, which ran several miles north along the creek drainage. She started going with him after some time because the alternative was sitting in the cabin alone, and she was worse at being alone than she'd thought. The trap lines were brutal and honest in the way the wilderness itself was brutal and honest. There was nothing comfortable about what they did out there. Animals died. That was the fact of it. Asher worked quickly and without ceremony, resetting the traps, collecting what was in them, explaining to her. When she asked what each animal's pelt was worth and what it was used for, and how you could tell a healthy skin from a damaged one, he taught her to skin a beaver without ruining the hide, his big hands guiding hers through the cuts with a patience she hadn't expected from a man who struggled so visibly to string two sentences together in ordinary conversation. "You're good at teaching," she told him one afternoon, while they were working over a frozen creek bank with their breath coming out in thick clouds. "You're not good at talking, but you're good at teaching." He considered that. "Different things," he said. "How so?" "Talking is mostly for the person talking. Teaching is for the other person." He pulled the last trap from under the ice ledge and reset it with practiced movements. "I'm better at things that aren't about me." She looked at him. He was already standing and turning toward the trail back, and she watched his back for a moment. The heavy fur coat, the rifle across his shoulders, the particular way he moved through snow like he was part of it rather than fighting it. "That's either very humble or very sad," she said. "Probably both," he said without turning around. She caught up and walked beside him, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence had changed since the first day. It was looser now. There was room in it. After some weeks, it snowed for several days without stopping. Not the gentle accumulating snow of the lower passes, a real mountain storm, the kind that dropped deep snow in a short time and made the cabin shake in its bones on the windiest nights. The first night of it, Clara lay awake listening to the timbers groan and the wind screaming down from the peaks and tried to calculate how thoroughly she was trapped. The trail they'd come in on was buried. The passes below would be impassable until the season changed. She was months' journey from anyone who knew her name in a one-room cabin with a man she'd known for weeks, Boko. With nothing but his supplies and his knowledge standing between her and a very cold death, she found, to her own surprise, that she was not as frightened as she thought she'd be. Some of that was Asher. He moved through the storm days with total calm, with the focus of a man who had seen worse and survived it. And his calm was contagious in the most functional possible way, not reassuring in a false way. He wasn't the type to tell her everything was fine when it wasn't, but steady in a way that was better than false reassurance. He checked the stable each day to make sure the horses and the mule were sheltered and eating. He banked the stove carefully to keep heat constant without burning through their wood too fast. He sat at the table in the evenings and did the kind of maintenance work that wilderness men did, sharpening knives, mending harness leather, rechecking the supplies against a list he kept in a small notebook with cramped, careful handwriting. On the second night of the storm, when the wind was at its worst, Clara pulled a book from the shelf. One of his books, an old battered copy of Roughing It with water damage on the spine, and read aloud from it, partly because she was going stir-crazy and partly on impulse, because her mother had always read aloud in the evenings and the habit was apparently stitched into her. Asher looked up from the harness he was working on. She kept reading. After a few minutes, he set the harness down and just listened, and she could feel it, the quality of his attention, how completely he gave it when he gave it at all. She read for some time until her voice started to tire, and when she stopped, he was quiet for a long moment. "You read well," he said. "My mother taught me." She put the book down. "Do you read much? You have a lot of books for someone who lives alone." "Winter's long," he said. Then, after a pause, "I don't read as well as you. Words come slower for me off a page." "You could read to me sometime if you wanted," she said. "Slower is fine." He looked at the books on the shelf, then at her, then back at the harness, which he picked up again. "Maybe," he said. He did. Some days later, sitting across from her at the table, the storm finally quieted. A Bret Harte story she'd never read, his voice rough and halting over the longer words, pausing sometimes to sound something out. She didn't correct him. She just listened to the story, and to the crackling stove, and to the way his voice changed when he got into a passage he liked. Slightly less careful, slightly more present. Like a man forgetting to watch himself. That was when she started seeing him differently. Not because of the reading, exactly, because of what the reading showed her. That there were things he was willing to be bad at in front of her. That was a kind of trust she hadn't been expecting from him this soon, and it caught her off guard the way the deep drifts caught her sometimes on the trail. Suddenly, completely, without warning, she started paying a different kind of attention. She noticed that he always refilled her coffee before he refilled his own. That he repaired a split in her boot heel while she slept one night and left it by the door without saying anything. That he had a habit when he was working through a problem, a trap placement, a weather calculation, of going very still and looking at nothing, just processing, and that during those moments he looked younger somehow. The weathered competence of his face replaced by something plainer and less defended. She noticed the books, not just that he had them, but what they were: geology texts, a natural history of North American mammals. 2 novels, a slim volume of poetry that looked like it had been read more than the others, its spine soft and curved from use. She pulled it from the shelf one afternoon while he was out and found it was Whitman. She put it back and didn't say anything, but the knowledge settled somewhere in her and stayed. She also noticed how he handled pain. Later on, He sliced his palm open on a trap spring that snapped wrong. A nasty cut, deep enough to need closing. He wrapped it himself in a strip of cloth and said nothing about it until she saw him favoring the hand over supper and made him unwrap it. "That needs stitching," she said. "It'll close." "Asher, it needs stitching." She looked up at him. "I can do it. My mother stitched my father's arm closed after a farming accident when I was younger. I can do it." He looked at her. His jaw was set in the way she'd come to recognize. That stubborn, flat expression that meant he was about to refuse something. She held his gaze and waited, and he must have seen something in her face that persuaded him, because after a moment he sat down and put his hand on the table. "There's a kit," he said, "in the top shelf." She found it and boiled the needle clean and did what needed to be done. He didn't flinch. He watched her work with his head bent and his expression closed off, and she focused on the work and tried not to think about how strange it was to be this close to him, this deliberate and careful with a part of him that was hurt. When she tied off the last stitch, she looked up and found him watching her face. "Thank you," he said, quiet, like it cost him something to say it. "You're difficult," she said. "You know that." "So I've been told." "By who?" He thought about it. "My mother, before she died." A pause. Nobody else was around long enough after that. She set the needle kit aside and didn't push further because she could feel the edge of something there, some territory in him that she could see the shape of but couldn't map yet. And she'd learned enough about Asher Boone to know that the way in wasn't through pushing. It was through waiting, through being present without demanding, through being the kind of person who didn't require anything from him that he wasn't ready to give. It was, she thought, a strange and specific skill she seemed to have developed in the recent time. She wasn't sure what to do with it. The night the mountain lion came, it was the worst cold of the winter. Well below zero, the kind of temperature that froze your nose hairs and made the trees crack in the dark like rifle shots. Clara had been asleep for some time when the horses started screaming. Not panicking, screaming. There's a difference, and the difference woke her completely and instantly, heart slamming, sitting up with the quilt clutched in both hands before she was even fully conscious. Asher was already at the door with the rifle. He went out into the dark without a lantern. She heard the sounds from the stable. The horses crashing against their stalls, the mule braying, and then a sound she'd never heard before. A sound that was wrong in a deep animal way. A screaming snarl that her body understood before her mind did. She pulled on her boots and coat and grabbed the Winchester from its place by the door and followed him. The stable was chaos. Her lantern threw wild shadows across the horses, both of them rearing, eyes showing white, fighting the tie ropes. The mule had broken its rope entirely and was in the corner, and crouched on the rafter beam above the mule's stall was the mountain lion. A female, lean with winter hunger, enormous in the confined space. Her yellow eyes catching the lantern light and throwing it back cold and furious. Asher was below her, rifle up, but the angle was wrong. Firing up into the rafters in an enclosed space full of panicking horses was a different calculation than shooting in open country. The lion moved. She dropped from the beam, not at Asher, at the mule, and Asher was between them before Clara could process what she was seeing, throwing himself forward with a sound she'd never heard from him before, and the cat hit him instead. Everything happened in pieces after that. The sound of it, the horses going insane, Asher and the lion in the hay, and Asher had the rifle crosswise, and the cat was trying to get past it. And the sound she was making was something Clara would hear in her sleep for a long time after. Clara raised the Winchester and couldn't fire. The angle was wrong. She'd hit him, and she moved sideways, kept moving, looking for the angle, and then she had it. A clean shot at the lion's shoulder from close range. She fired. The shot went true. The lion spasmed and released and tried to stand, and Asher had the rifle up and fired from his back, and it was over. Total silence. Then the horses screaming again, more desperately than before. Clara moved to Asher. He was already pushing himself up, one hand pressed to his side, and when the lantern light hit his coat, she saw the dark spreading there, and her stomach dropped. "How bad?" she said. "I've had worse." "That is not an answer." "I'm standing," he said. He was barely, and his face was the color of the snow outside. "Let's get the animals settled first. You're bleeding. I know that." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression. Pain. Yes, but also something that might have been surprised, like he was still processing the fact of what she'd done. "You made that shot?" "Yes. From that angle. In that light, with the horses." "Asher?" She put her hand on his arm over the coat, pressing. "We're going to talk about it later. Right now, I need to look at your side." He let her lead him back to the cabin. The wounds were several deep lacerations across his ribs, long but not as deep as she'd feared. The heavy coat had taken some of it. She cleaned them with the whiskey from his supply shelf, and he sat very still and said nothing, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the far wall. She could feel the effort of his stillness, the way he was managing pain the only way he apparently knew how, which was to wall it away somewhere and deal with it privately. "You didn't have to put yourself between her and the mule," she said while she worked. "Mule's worth money. So are you." He didn't answer. "Asher?" She tied off the last bandage and sat back and looked at him. He looked terrible, pale and tightly wound and exhausted in a way that was different from tired. "You matter. You understand that. The mule matters less." He looked at her. Something in his face was doing something she couldn't read. Something complicated and undefended that he hadn't meant to show her. "Get some sleep," he said finally. His voice was rougher than usual. "I'll take first watch." "You absolutely will not," she said, "and you'll sleep. I'll watch." "Clara?" "Sleep, Asher." A long moment. Then he lay back on his bedroll, slowly and with visible effort, and closed his eyes. She sat by the fire with the Winchester across her knees and listened to his breathing slow toward sleep, and the storm outside, and the horses in the stable, who had finally gradually gone quiet. She sat there for a long time, and somewhere in the hours between midnight and dawn, with the fire burning low, and the man sleeping behind her and the mountains pressing in from every direction, she stopped asking herself what she felt, and started simply feeling it. She was in love with him. She didn't know what to do with that yet. It was too large and too complicated, and the situation they were in was too tangled up with obligation and isolation for her to trust the feeling easily. Maybe it was just winter. Maybe it was just the mountain lion and the blood and the particular closeness of danger. Maybe it was just that he was the only person she had. But she'd never been good at lying to herself, and she sat there in the firelight, holding the rifle and watching him sleep, and she knew what it was. He had a fever by morning. Clara found out when she went to wake him at first light, and put her hand on his shoulder and felt the heat radiating off him through 2 layers of wool. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead the way her mother used to do, the old instinct, the one you never forget, and pulled it back fast. "Asher." He opened his eyes. They were glassy and slightly unfocused, which on a man like him was alarming in a way that the same look on an ordinary person wouldn't have been. Asher's eyes were always focused. They were the eyes of a man who tracked things for a living, who read terrain and weather and animal behavior with the same precision a scholar brought to text. Seeing them soft and vague was wrong, the way a compass spinning wrong was wrong. "I'm fine," he said, automatic, like a reflex. "You have a fever. It'll pass." "Asher." She sat on the edge of the floor beside his bedroll and looked at him directly. "The cat opened you up pretty good. Wounds like that go bad fast, especially out here. You know that better than I do." She paused. "Let me look at the bandaging." He started to push himself up and winced hard enough that his breath caught, which told her everything about the actual state of his ribs. She put a hand on his chest and he stopped. "Stay down," she said. He stayed down. She unwrapped the bandaging carefully. The wounds had closed, which was something, but some of the lacerations were red and swollen around the edges in a way that made her stomach tighten. Not badly infected yet, not the dark spreading kind that meant real trouble, but heading that direction without intervention. She'd watched her mother treat infected wounds before. She remembered the smell of the poultice her mother made, the particular color of infected skin at different stages, the way you could tell what you were dealing with if you looked at it without flinching. She looked without flinching. "I need to clean these again," she said. "It's going to hurt more than last night." "All right. I mean it. It's going to hurt considerably, Asher." He looked at her with those fever-glazed eyes, and even through the glaze there was a dryness in them that was entirely him. "I've been clawed by a mountain lion. I'm aware pain is involved. I just wanted you to know you can make noise about it. I won't think less of you." A pause. "I'll keep that in mind," he said in a tone that made it clear he would not be making noise about it. She used the last of the whiskey and some dried yarrow from his supply shelf that she hadn't known what it was for until she found the handwritten medical notes he kept in the back of the supply notebook. Plants, their uses, dosages, symptoms. His handwriting again, careful and cramped. She wondered when he'd written all of it down, alone up here, building a record of everything he knew in case he needed it and had no one to ask. She thought about that while she worked, and it made her chest ache in a way she was getting used to. He made no noise. She hadn't expected him to, but she'd meant what she said about not thinking less of him for it, and she wished he'd believed her. He went pale, and his jaw went rigid, and his free hand found the edge of the bedroll and gripped it, but he didn't make a sound. And when she was done and retying the bandaging, he let out a long, controlled breath like a man releasing something he'd been holding for a while. "Better?" she said. "Considerably," he said like he was borrowing her word back. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The fever was real, and it was going to get worse before it got better. That was just the nature of it. She'd need to keep him hydrated and warm and still, which was going to be its own battle with a man constitutionally incapable of staying still. "You're going to stay in that bedroll today," she said. "The trap lines will still be there tomorrow or the day after." She stood up and went to put water on the stove. "I'll check the animals. I'll bring in wood. You're going to drink water and sleep." Silence from the direction of the bedroll. "Asher, I heard you," he said with the particular tone of a man who had heard and was not happy about it. "Good." She went out to check the stable. The horses had calmed in the night. The mule was still skittish, circling its stall with its ears laid flat, but none of them were hurt. The mountain lion's body was stiff in the corner where it had fallen, and she dragged it outside herself, which was hard and unpleasant and necessary, and didn't think too much about it. The cold outside was something else entirely. The deep, absolute cold of a high mountain morning after a hard night. The kind that made your lungs feel like they were taking in glass. But the sky was clear for the first time in days, hard blue from horizon to horizon, and the snow on the peaks above the lake blazed white in the early light with a beauty that was almost violent in its intensity. She stood in it for a moment, just breathing, before she went back inside. He was asleep when she returned. She built the fire up and started broth from the dried venison stock, and sat at the table and watched him sleep, and tried to think clearly about the situation, which was what she did when feelings got too large. She made herself look at the practical facts of things until the feelings became manageable. The practical facts. They were well into winter, still months from any possible travel. He was injured and feverish and dependent on her right now in a way that reversed the entire power structure of the previous time. She had enough medical knowledge to handle this if it didn't get worse, and enough sense to recognize if it did get worse. The food and wood supply was adequate. The animals were uninjured. Those were the practical facts. The other sound, the one that was not practical at all, sat in her chest and refused to be managed no matter how many times she tried to look at something else instead. He woke in the afternoon burning hotter than before, disoriented enough that when she spoke to him, he took a moment to place her face. And that moment, that brief, terrible second where his eyes went uncertain, was the most frightened she'd been since Langford rode onto her father's property. "Hey," she said, sharply enough to cut through. "Asher, look at me." His eyes found her, focused. "There you are," she said. "Where'd you think I went?" he said. His voice was rough with fever. "Somewhere I couldn't follow." She helped him sit up enough to drink the broth. He drank it badly, too fast, then not fast enough. And some of it went down wrong, and he coughed and swore under his breath. The first profanity she'd heard from him, which struck her as faintly funny even now. "Language," she said. "You just scalded me. It's lukewarm. My throat disagrees." But he drank the rest of it without complaint, and she could see him working to stay present, fighting the fever's pull. "The way you fight sleep when you know you need to stay awake. Talk to me," she said. She pulled the chair close to the bedroll and sat in it. "About something. Anything. Why? Because you need to stay awake for a while longer, and I think talking is harder for you than staying awake. So if you can manage the talking, you can manage the rest." He looked at her. Even feverish, there was something appreciative in his expression, some recognition of the logic that he couldn't quite hide. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Tell me about your family." The something appreciative went away. She'd expected that. "You don't have to," she said. "But you could." A long silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing snow crystals against the window glass in a sound like dry sand. "My father trapped," he said finally. "Up in Montana, before it was a territory. He was a rough man. Not cruel, just rough. The way men are who've only ever had hard things." He stopped. "My mother was better than he deserved. Most men's mothers are, I think." Another pause. "She died when I was young. Fever, same as this." He glanced at his own hand resting on the quilt like it belonged to someone else. "Took her quickly. I'm sorry," Clara said. She meant it without ornamentation. "My father drank after that, worked less. The trapping went bad 2 winters running, and we had nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "He died when I was still young. Not the drinking directly. A trapping accident. Alone on the line in winter. Nobody found him for some time." She sat with that, the weight of it. A young boy finding his father's body frozen in the wilderness. "And then you were alone," she said. "And then I was alone." He said it plainly, without self-pity. "The way you state a weather condition. It happened, and it was a fact, and there it was. I knew enough to survive. My father taught me that much before the drinking took him, and I was better at being alone than most. I didn't mind the quiet the way some people do. Until you did," she said. He looked at her. "Until I did," he agreed. She thought about a young boy already alone, already shaped by all of that, sitting on a Missouri riverbank with a drowning girl and carving her a sparrow. She thought about what kind of person that was, what it said about who he'd been before the wilderness finished its work on him. "You were kind," she said. "When I was a child. You didn't have to stay. Most people would have pulled me out and moved on." "You were scared," he said. Like it was that simple. Like the only possible response to a scared child was to sit with her until she wasn't scared anymore. "You've been carrying that for many years," she said. He didn't answer, but she could see that she was right. "Asher." She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. Why did you really come for me? Not, I understand what you told my father. I understand the logic of it. But you spent everything you had. You changed your whole life, and you barely knew me. He was quiet for long enough that she thought the fever had pulled him under again. Then he said, I knew you enough. From one afternoon on a riverbank. Some things you know fast. His eyes were closing despite his efforts, the fever finally winning. I wasn't looking for a transaction. I want you to know that. I didn't save you because I wanted something from you. I know that, she said. And she did now. She'd known it for some time, probably. Get some sleep. I'm sorry, he said. His voice was going soft and blurred. For how it looked, the way I did it. I know it looked like, sleep, Asher. Like I bought you. I said sleep. A moment. Then, Clara. What? The sparrow you said you kept. The one from the river. His eyes were fully closed now. Did you really keep it? She reached into the pocket of her skirt. The little carving was there, worn smooth from years of handling. The grain of the wood silky under her fingers. She'd carried it since she was a child without knowing why. The way you carry things that are connected to moments your heart won't let go of. She pressed it into his open hand. His fingers closed around it, and his whole body seemed to let go of something, and he slept. She sat beside him through the long afternoon and into the evening, feeding the fire, watching his chest rise and fall. And somewhere in the hours between sunset and dark, the fever broke. She knew it when it happened. The sweat came, sudden and drenching, and his breathing changed from the tight, labored quality of a man fighting his own body to something slower and more ordinary. She pressed her hand to his forehead, cool, or near enough. She sat back in her chair and realized her own hands were shaking slightly, which she hadn't noticed until now. She'd been running on focused attention for hours, and now that the attention could release, her body was processing everything it had been too busy to feel. The lion, the blood, the fear this morning when his eyes went unfocused, the hours of sitting here doing small, careful things and hoping they were enough. She pressed her hands flat on her knees until they stopped shaking. Then she made herself dinner and ate it alone at the table and watched the snow fall against the dark window glass. He recovered slowly. Not because he wasn't strong. He was absurdly strong. Had the constitution of a man who'd survived everything the wilderness could throw at him for years. But because he pushed himself too hard too soon, which she should have predicted. In the days of recovery, he was up trying to haul water, and she found him in the yard and sent him back inside with a sharpness in her voice that surprised them both. I'm not an invalid, he said. No, but you're acting like a fool, which is almost worse. She took the water bucket from him. Go inside, Asher. You've been doing everything for days. I'm aware. I've been there for all of it. She started for the water hole. I don't need your help right now. I need you to not tear those stitches so I don't have to do them again. She heard him behind her, not moving toward the cabin. She turned. What? She said. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the careful weather-reading look. Not the flat, stubborn look. Not the almost smile. Something rawer than any of those. Something that sat uncomfortably close to the surface of his face, which on Asher Boone was practically unheard of. Nobody's ever done this, he said. For me? Like this. She stood in the snow with the water bucket and looked at him. Taking care of you when you were sick? She said. Taking care of me, he said. Just in general. Like I mattered enough to. He stopped, looked away. His jaw worked for a moment. I'm not good at saying things. You're saying this one all right? She said. He looked back at her. The rawness in his face hadn't gone away. She walked back to him, which was a few steps, And then she was standing close enough to see the texture of the scar on his cheek, and the particular dark gray of his eyes, and the way those eyes were looking at her, like she was something he was still trying to believe was real. She reached up and put her hand against the scarred side of his face. He went absolutely still. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You understand that? I'm not here because I'm trapped. And I'm not here because I don't have a choice. I'm here because I want to be." That changed. I don't know exactly when it changed, but it did. She held his gaze. "So stop looking at me like I'm about to disappear." He turned his face very slightly into her hand, just a fraction, just enough that she felt it. "All right," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Go inside," she said. "I'll get the water." He went inside. She stood in the cold for a moment, her hand still warm from his face, and took one long breath of mountain air, sharp and clean and thin, and then she went to get the water. After that, something between them settled. Not resolved. Things between two people as stubborn and complicated as Asher Boone and Clara Mercer didn't resolve cleanly, didn't snap into place like a puzzle piece finding its home. It was messier than that. There were evenings where he went quiet in a way that had edges to it, and she couldn't tell if it was something she'd done or just the interior weather of a man who'd spent years alone and hadn't fully learned to share his silences yet. There were mornings where she woke sharp-tempered from bad sleep and snapped at him over something small, and he absorbed it without retaliation in a way that somehow made her feel worse than if he'd snapped back. But there were also other things. There was the evening he came back from the trap lines with something wrapped in a piece of canvas and set it on the table in front of her without explanation. She unwrapped it and found a bird skull, perfect and delicate and white, with the particular elegant architecture of a raptor, a hawk maybe, or a small falcon. "Found it on the north drainage," he said. "Thought you'd like it." She turned it in her hands, looking at the hollows of the eye sockets, the fine fragility of the beak. "I do like it," she said. "I like it very much." He sat down across from her and opened the Whitman and started reading, slow and careful, his big hands holding the small book with a gentleness she'd noticed he had for small or fragile things. And she sat across from him with the bird skull in her hands and listened. There was the afternoon a warm front came down from the north, warm being relative, and they went out onto the lake ice because he wanted to show her something. And what he showed her was the way the ice had developed pressure cracks in a particular pattern, long white lines radiating outward like a frozen lightning strike that were, he said, completely specific to this lake, to the way the spring ran under the northwest corner and kept the ice thinner there, and the stress found its way outward in the same pattern every year. He knew this because he'd watched it happen several times now, alone. She stood on the ice looking at the cracks and thought about that. Several winters of noticing something beautiful and specific and having no one to show it to. And she didn't say anything about it, just stood beside him, looking at the pattern in the ice, until he said quietly, "I'm glad you're here to see it." She took his hand. He didn't pull away. He held on, and they stood on the frozen lake in the winter light, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. As winter continued, they had stopped being two people sharing a space and become something harder to name. Two people who'd been forged together by cold and proximity, and the particular pressure of needing each other to survive the way metal gets forged, the way the process leaves it different from what it was before. Not perfect. Nothing in that cabin was perfect, and nothing between them was simple, but real in the way only things that have been tested are real. She stopped sleeping near the stove. It happened gradually, and then suddenly, the way most things between people happen. Weeks of the distance between them narrowing in small increments, and then one night when a storm came down and the cold was absolute, and he said, without looking at her, "You don't have to be cold," and she moved her bedroll to the bed without a word. He lay down beside her. They lay in the dark and listened to the storm, and neither of them moved for a long time. Both of them aware of the other, with a totality that made ordinary awareness feel partial. Then he said in the dark, "Is this all right?" "Yes," she said. "Is it all right with you?" A pause. "Yes?" She turned toward him. He was facing her, and in the dark she could just make out the shape of his face, the line of his jaw, the scar that she'd stopped noticing in the same way you stop noticing the shape of a familiar room. "Asher?" she said. "What?" "I'm glad I came with you," she said. "I want you to know that. Not in spite of everything, because of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face, very carefully, like she was the bird skull or the Whitman book or some other thing that could be damaged by carelessness. His hand stayed against her cheek. "I know I did it wrong," he said. "The way I came to you, I know that." "You did it the only way you knew," she said. "And then you did everything else right." She felt him exhale. That same long release she'd heard when the fever broke. A man letting go of something he'd been holding too long. The storm shook the cabin walls, and the fire burned low. And outside, the mountains stood in their cold, absolute dark, indifferent to everything beneath them. But inside, something quiet and permanent had taken hold. Spring came to the Bitterroot the way it always came to high country, reluctantly, in pieces, fighting winter every inch of the way. The first signs were subtle enough that you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. A change in the quality of the afternoon light, going from the flat white of winter to something with actual warmth in it. The sound of water moving beneath the lake ice, the creek starting to run again somewhere under the snowpack, the horses getting restless in their stalls in a way they hadn't been for months, picking up something in the air that the humans couldn't quite name yet. Asher tracked it the way he tracked everything, methodically, with a precision that Clara had stopped finding strange and started finding reassuring. He kept a small notebook of daily observations. Temperature at dawn, cloud patterns, wind direction, snow depth at the marker stake he'd driven into the ground some distance from the cabin door. He'd been keeping the same record for several winters, and he could read the accumulated data the way other men read maps. "Some weeks more," he told her one morning, studying the stake from the porch. "And then the pass is open, slowly, south-facing slopes first. The main trail we came in on, probably before I'd risk a loaded horse on it." She stood beside him on the porch with her coffee, looking out at the lake. The ice had gone gray and porous at the edges, the first sign of its surrender. The mountain above them was still white from peak to tree line, but the south wall of the valley had started showing bare rock in patches, dark against the snow like emerging continents. "Are you thinking about going down?" he said. He didn't look at her when he asked it. "No," she said. Then, because she believed in accuracy, "My father. I want to know if he's all right. I've been thinking about him. We could get word to him. Once the passes are clear enough for a man on foot, I can get down to Granger Creek and back in some days." She looked at him then. "You'd do that?" He gave her the look that meant he found the question unnecessary. "He's your father." She turned back to the lake. Thought about her father at that kitchen table, watching her ride away. Thought about Langford's flat, patient eyes in the moment before he turned his horse and left the property. "Do you think Langford let it go?" she said. Asher was quiet for a moment. Not the considering kind of quiet, the kind where the answer was already there, and he was deciding how much of it to give her. "No," he said. "I didn't think so either." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. A raven landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, looked at them both with its particular intelligent contempt, and flew away. "Men like Langford," Asher said, "don't let things go. Not when they think they've been made to look small. The money was one thing. He lost money, and he's got enough that money alone wouldn't drive him this far. But I walked onto his operation in front of his own hired men and paid off his debt and took you away, and he had no answer for it." He paused. That kind of man keeps a ledger, not of money, of respect. So he's coming. Eventually, when he figures out where we are. Another pause. He'll figure it out. She thought about that through the morning while she worked on mending the harness leather that had cracked in the cold, sitting at the table with the oil and the stitching awl, her hands working by feel while her mind went to other places. She thought about Langford's men, the two riders with their flat expressions and their hip revolvers, and the kind of men Langford could hire if he decided to bring more. She thought about the trail into the mountains and the fact that the same passes that had sealed them in safely all winter would soon be open to anyone with a horse and a reason to make the climb. Asher came in for midday and found her at the table and saw immediately what was on her face, because he'd gotten good at that. Reading her the way he read terrain, watching for the small signs. "I want to learn the rifle," she said. "Properly, not just the Winchester. I want to learn the Sharps." He sat down across from her. The Sharps was his long-range rifle, a big-bore, single-shot buffalo gun, heavy and unforgiving. The kind of weapon that could drop a bison at distance or a man at closer range. She'd seen him with it, but never touched it. "The Sharps kicks like a mule," he said. "I know. It's not a repeater. One shot, then you reload. You have to make it count. I know that too." He studied her for a moment. Then he stood up and took the Sharps down from its place on the wall and set it on the table in front of her. "We start tomorrow," he said. "When the light's good." He was not wrong about the kick. The first time she fired the Sharps, braced against a pine tree at the edge of the clearing, the recoil snapped through her shoulder like a door slamming, and she stepped back hard and would have gone down if the tree hadn't been there. Asher caught her elbow anyway, a steadying hand that was there and gone before she'd finished processing it. "Both feet," he said. "Plant like you mean it. Wide stance, front foot forward. You have to commit your whole body to this one. You could have led with that. You needed to feel it first." He stepped back. Again, she loaded the Sharps. He'd shown her the process, and she'd practiced it dry until the sequence was automatic, and planted her feet and fired again. The recoil was still brutal, but she didn't move. Stayed rooted. Felt the shock run up through her whole skeleton and out the top of her head, and kept her feet anyway. She hit the target, a white-painted square on a Douglas fir some distance out, clean through the center. Asher was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's some distance," she said. "What range can you actually hit something reliably?" "Depends on conditions. Wind, light, elevation. In ideal conditions, further. On most days, less." She loaded again and fired at a second target, further out, a slash of white paint she could barely distinguish from the gray bark. She hit the edge of it. Not clean, but a hit. "Further," Asher said, like he was reading a thermometer. "Don't sound so surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I told you before. You listen." The days that followed had a different quality than the winter months. Winter had been about survival and endurance and the slow interior work of two people learning each other in close quarters. This was something more deliberate. Asher started teaching her things he'd never thought to teach anyone before. Not just shooting, but the full grammar of the wilderness. How to read sign on a trail. How to calculate wind drift and adjust a shot. How to identify the particular silence that preceded an ambush. The difference between an empty forest and a watched one. He taught her how men moved when they were hunting something versus when they were lost. The behavioral difference in tracks, in broken branches, in the way smoke from a fire drifted differently when someone was trying to hide it. She absorbed it all with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and he watched her become something different from what she'd been when this began. Not unrecognizable. She was still Clara, still sharp-tongued and direct, and capable of silences that had as much content as speech. But there was a new quality to her movements, a groundedness, like she'd found the level of herself out here in a way that the life she'd come from had never offered. He loved her. He'd known it for some time. He hadn't said it yet because the words sat in him like a stone, solid, present, occasionally uncomfortable, not going anywhere. And the right moment for extracting a stone was a technical problem he hadn't solved. She knew, he thought. She knew the way she knew most things about him, which was before he told her, and without requiring him to. He said it on an afternoon when they were on the lake ice. It was safe still. The freeze still solid in the center, even as the edges softened. And she'd found a crack in the ice surface that had refrozen clear, and she was lying on her stomach looking through it at the dark water below, her breath fogging against the ice. "There's a fish," she said. "Right there. You can see it." He lay down beside her and looked. She was right. A dark shape moving slow and deliberate about some distance below, visible through the clear ice like something through dark glass. "Trout," he said. "Lake's full of them. They just stay down there all winter? Slows down in cold water. They're alive, but barely moving." "That sounds awful," she said. "I don't know. Might be peaceful." You watch the fish move past and disappear into the dark. Nothing to worry about. Nothing coming for you. Just slow and quiet and cold. She turned her head and looked at him. They were close. The way you got lying side by side, faces maybe a foot apart, the ice cold under both of them. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said most things, direct, without decoration, slightly like a man reading from a page he was relieved to have found. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he started to wonder if he'd miscalculated, if he'd moved wrong somehow, if the thing he was certain she knew had somehow been wrong. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." A pause. "I love you too. I've been waiting for you to say it first because I didn't think you could handle it if I said it first." He thought about that. "You're probably right," he said. "I'm definitely right." She turned back to look through the ice. "You'd have found a way to make it into something complicated." "It is complicated." "It really isn't." She pressed her palm flat against the clear ice above where the fish had been. "It's actually the least complicated thing that's happened to me in a long time." He lay there on the ice beside her and looked at the dark water below and thought about that and found that she was right. She was right about most things, as it turned out. As the snow began to melt and winter loosened its grip, the snow came off the south slopes in steady rivulets that joined the creek, which rose and ran fast and cold and clear, cutting through the remaining snow in the valley floor with purpose. The passes began to show bare rock on their upper faces. The horses grew restless in their stalls. The lake ice groaned and cracked, and one morning Clara woke to the sound of it shifting. A deep, resonant groan that moved through the whole structure, and she knew it was going. Some days later, the ice was gone, and the lake was open water, gunmetal gray and slightly choppy in the spring wind, and it looked like the world had opened its eyes. Asher went down to Granger Creek alone. He was gone some days as promised, and she spent those days telling herself she was not anxious, which she was, and occupying herself with the work of the cabin and the yard and the animals, which kept her hands busy without fully engaging her head. When he rode back up the trail on the evening of the return, she was at the stable, and she heard the dun stallion's feet on the trail before she saw them, and she came out of the stable door and stood in the yard and waited. He came out of the pines at the trail's end and pulled up in the yard and swung down, and the look on his face told her before he spoke. She braced. "Your father passed in the winter," he said. "A neighbor told me. Heart, they think, in his sleep." She'd known somewhere below the hoping. She'd known from the way her thoughts went to him, not with anxiety, which was what you felt about people you might still lose, but with a specific and settled grief that had no more urgency in it. "Was he alone?" she said. "The neighbor was checking on him regular. Found him that morning." He paused. He didn't suffer. She nodded. She put her hand on the stallion's neck and felt the horse's warmth and the texture of its coat under her palm and focused on that while she got herself level. "He knew you were safe," Asher said. "When you left, he knew I wasn't Langford." "He didn't know that for certain." "No," Asher said. "But he hoped it." She looked up. His eyes were on her with that careful, full attention she'd stopped taking for granted. "What else?" she said. Because there was something else. She could see it. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it for a moment before he gave it to her. "There's talk in town. Langford's been asking about the Mercer property. Survey teams he had there this past season." He paused. "Apparently there's silver under the east field." She stared at him. "Yeah, a lot of silver," he said. "Enough that people are talking about it in a town some distance away." He watched her unfold the paper. It was a page from a Billings newspaper, recent, with a brief item about mineral survey activity in the Granger Creek area. "Your father died before the surveys were complete. That means the property passes to you. You're the heir." She read the item twice. The words kept rearranging themselves in ways that didn't quite make sense. "Langford knows," she said. "Langford almost certainly knows. He had survey teams on the property, which means someone working for him found it." She folded the paper and looked out at the lake. The water was going dark in the failing light, silver and black, shifting. "This is why he's coming," she said. "Not just pride. This, yes, he needs my signature to claim it legally. The deed is in my name. Yes." She turned the paper over in her hands. Thought about the east field. The flat, rocky stretch where nothing had ever grown properly, where the soil was thin over stone, and her father had always cursed it. She thought about him walking that field for years, not knowing what was underneath it. The particular misery of that. "How long do we have?" she said. "I don't know. The passes have been open for some time. If he's been waiting for that." Asher stopped. Then, "I set some marks on the trail coming up. Trip lines. Nothing lethal. Just enough to tell us if someone's coming up that route." He looked at her steadily. "I should have done it earlier." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He accepted that without defense because he was right and she was right, and they both knew it. "I won't sign it," she said. "Whatever he wants, I won't sign it." "I know. Even if he—" She stopped. "He's going to come with men, not just 2 men like last time." "Probably. And we're up here, 2 of us." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them was the full weight of what that meant, and neither of them was willing to soften it by pretending it was something different. "All right," she said. She went inside and got the Winchester. She was cleaning and checking it at the table when Asher came in and watched her for a moment. He didn't say anything. He went to the shelf and took down the ammunition and set it on the table beside her without being asked. And then he sat down with the Sharps and began doing the same thing she was doing, both of them working in the lamplight with the efficiency of people who had been practicing this, had been building toward this without fully acknowledging it. The marks on the trail were triggered on one morning. Asher was up before dawn, checking the trap lines, and Clara was in the stable feeding the horses when she heard him coming back fast, not running, but moving with purpose, a speed he didn't use for ordinary returns, and she was out of the stable by the time he cleared the tree line. "Several riders," he said. "Maybe an hour behind me. They came up the South Pass." He didn't slow down, heading for the cabin. "Armed. Some with rifles, some with revolvers that I could see." "You're sure it's Langford?" "No, but I'm sure it's not trappers." He held the door for her without thinking about it. An instinctive courtesy that she noticed even now, in this moment, and filed away with all the other things about him she intended to keep. Inside, she went to the window that faced south, the only direction they'd be coming from, given the trail, while he went to the rack and took down the Sharps and began loading it with the calm, methodical movements of a man who had made peace with what was coming. "I'm going up," he said. She turned. He was looking at the ridge above the cabin, the granite shelf that jutted out some distance above the valley floor with a clear line of sight down the entire southern approach. She'd heard him talk about that position before, in the abstract when they were discussing the geography of the area. Now it wasn't abstract. "The cabin," she said. "You hold it." He met her eyes. "Only fire if they come to you directly. Don't fire wide. You've got limited ammunition, and you need every round to count. If they threaten the structure, use the Winchester first. Short distance, and—" He paused. "Clara." "What?" "You don't have to defend property. You understand me? If it goes wrong, you take a horse and you go north. The Crown of the Sky drainage, some distance north. I've told you about it. You go there, and you wait. I'm not leaving you. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm telling you that if it gets bad, you have an option." She looked at him. His face was set in the way it got when he was moving through a serious problem. Not fearless, because she knew him well enough now to know the difference between fearless and managed. He was afraid. He was managing it with both hands and doing it well. "Come back down in one piece," she said. "I intend to," he said. Then, because it was true, and this seemed like a moment when true things should be said, "I love you." "I know," she said. "Go." He went out the back, up the steep slope behind the cabin with the sharps and a cartridge belt and the particular ground-eating stride of a man who had been climbing mountains his whole life. She watched him go until he disappeared over the cabin's roofline, and then she turned back to the window. Some time later, several riders came out of the pines at the south end of the valley. She recognized Langford immediately, even at distance, the upright seat, the dark horse, the quality of stillness that expensive men carry like a garment. Beside him rode a man she didn't know, thick through the chest with a rifle across his saddle bow. Behind them, two more. One of them, she realized with a cold shift in her stomach, was one of the men from before. The one who'd put his hand near his revolver in her father's yard. They came into the yard slowly. Langford pulled up his horse some distance from the cabin door and looked at the building for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Boone," he called. He'd found out the name then. "I know you're in there. I'm not here for trouble. I'm here for a conversation." She said nothing. "Your father is dead," Langford said. The flatness of his voice when he said it, no acknowledgement of grief, no human margin around the fact, told her everything she needed to know about who she was dealing with. "The property passed to you. I have a legal offer prepared. A fair price, more than the land is worth on its own merits, and I'm asking you to come out and discuss it." She stayed at the window. Her hand was on the Winchester. "Come on out, girl," the thick man beside Langford said. His voice had a different quality, impatient with an edge in it that the pretense of civility didn't cover. "Nobody here needs a problem. Tell your man to watch his tone," Clara said loudly enough to carry through the window glass. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. A pause. Langford looked at her window directly. He'd located her by the sound. He was smarter than she wanted him to be. "Miss Mercer?" "Mrs. Boone," she said. Another pause. "Mrs. Boone, come out and let's talk." Like reasonable people. Sign the deed. Take the money. Go back to your life. That's all I'm asking. "You're asking me to sign over a silver deposit worth far more than what you're offering," she said, "and I'm not coming out." The thick man said something low to Langford that she couldn't hear. Langford's expression tightened just slightly, that same string-winding tension she'd seen before in her father's yard. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said. "The answer is the same." "Zad Samain," she said. He looked at the two men behind him and made a small gesture. One of them dismounted and started toward the cabin with a burning torch he lit from his saddlebag. Her stomach lurched. They were going to burn it. She'd considered it and dismissed it as too dramatic, too much, and she'd been wrong. Langford was the kind of man who'd burn a cabin with a woman in it and call it regrettable necessity. She raised the Winchester. She shot the torch out of the man's hand from the window distance. The crack of the shot was enormous in the valley. The man yelled and jumped back, and the burning torch went into the mud of the yard, sputtering. His horse bolted sideways. Langford's horse danced, and he fought it with his knees. The other men went for their weapons. "Next one goes through a hand," Clara said, loud and flat, and entirely sure of herself, which she was not, but sounded like she was. "The hand after that, I'm less specific about where it goes." Langford had his horse back under control. His face, from this distance, was furious in the particular way of men whose plans have been interfered with by someone they underestimated. "You're one woman," he said, "with one rifle. And my husband is on that ridge," she said, "with the Sharps." She watched Langford's eyes go to the granite shelf above the cabin. She watched him calculate the angle, the range, the implications. She watched him come to the conclusion she needed him to come to. Then the Sharp spoke from the ridge. The crack of it was a different order of magnitude from the Winchester. A deep, flat boom that rolled across the valley and came back off the far peaks as an echo. Some distance to the right of the riders, a granite boulder exploded in a spray of stone chips. A warning. Close enough to mean it. Far enough to mean he had range to spare. The thick man's horse went sideways into Langford's. One of the men in the back was already pulling his horse's head around toward the tree line. Langford shouted something at him. She could hear the anger in it, but not the words. And the man ignored him and kept going. Langford looked at Clara's window for a long moment. She looked back. Then he turned his horse and followed his men back toward the pines, unhurried in the particular way of a pun who needed to make clear that he was leaving by choice. She watched him all the way to the tree line, and then kept watching the space between the trees until Asher came down off the ridge some time later. He came through the cabin door and stopped in the middle of the room, rifle in hand, taking in the room and her face and the general situation in one quick survey. "You shot the torch," he said. "I did. From the window." "Yes." He looked at the window, looked at where the torch had been, out in the yard, which she knew he'd clocked on his way back down. Then he looked at her. "That was some distance," he said. "I know how far it is." Something moved across his face, something she recognized as pride, which he wasn't entirely comfortable with, which made it all the more legible. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes." "With more men?" "Yes." He set the Sharps on the table. "We can't hold this position indefinitely. Not two of us against however many he decides to bring." He looked at her. "We need to think about where we want to make the stand." She thought about what he'd said that morning. The crown of the sky drainage some distance north. She'd filed it away as an escape route, the option she wasn't planning to use. She started thinking about it differently. "Tell me about the terrain up there." She said. He pulled out the notebook and opened it to a page she hadn't seen. A hand-drawn map. Rough but precise, the way all his practical things were rough but precise. He spread it on the table, and she leaned over it beside him, their shoulders touching, the lamp throwing warm light across the page. Outside, the spring evening settled over the valley, and somewhere in the pines, Langford and his men were making their own plans. She traced the trail on the map with one finger. "Show me the narrow places," she said. They left before dawn, not running. Asher was particular about that distinction, and Clara had come to understand why it mattered. Running was panic. What they were doing was strategy, and strategy required you to move with intention rather than fear, even when the fear was legitimate, and the intention was to put as much mountain between yourself and armed men as physically possible before daylight. They packed only what was essential. Asher had a ruthless calculus for this. He'd done it before, she realized, packed for survival under pressure, and he moved through the cabin with the focused efficiency of someone running a drill he'd rehearsed mentally many times. Ammunition first, food for some time, dense and dry, and medical supplies, the Sharps and the Winchester and the Colt, and every round of ammunition they owned, bedrolls and the lightest canvas shelter. The rest, the books, the hawk skull she'd kept on the windowsill, the harness leather, months of accumulated small life. They left. She stood in the middle of the cabin for one moment before they went out. The fire was banked low. The table where they'd eaten and read and argued and learned each other was bare. The mantel above the fireplace was empty. She'd already put the carved sparrow in her coat pocket, which was the only thing she'd packed that wasn't strictly necessary, and the only thing she would have gone back for. Asher was at the door watching her. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the cabin for another second, all that winter in its walls, all that becoming. "Yes?" she said. They rode north in the dark, single file on the trail she'd traced with her finger the night before on Asher's hand-drawn map. The horses moved carefully through the pre-dawn blackness, picking their footing with the instinct of animals who'd worked this terrain before. Asher led. She followed. The trail climbed steeply out of the lake valley within the first stretch, switching back up through dense pine and spruce that blocked what little moonlight there was. And she rode by sound and feel and the particular quality of trust she'd developed in the dun stallion's judgment about where to put its feet. They didn't talk. The mountain required full attention and full quiet. Asher had impressed that on her before they left. And not just for the terrain's sake. Sound carried in these valleys in ways that were easy to underestimate. A voice at the wrong moment, a horseshoe ringing against rock, could carry some distance in still air. She thought about Langford's men camping somewhere south of the lake. She thought about what morning would bring them. The empty cabin, the cold fire, the tracks leading north. She thought about how long before they followed. Not long enough was the honest answer. Langford had not gotten where he was by being slow about things. By the time the sky began to gray in the east, they had climbed above the tree line. The trail, barely a trail up here, more of a series of understood passages through the rock and scrub, ran along the spine of a high ridge, with the world falling away on both sides. Below to the left, the lake valley they'd come from still in shadow. Below to the right, a series of deep drainages running east toward the open plains, their bottoms invisible in the dark. Asher pulled up on a flat section of rock and dismounted and went to the ridge's edge and looked south for a long time. She came up beside him and looked too. Nothing moving yet in the valley below, but the light was coming fast. "How far is Devil's Anvil?" she said. He'd named it the night before, the place on the map where the trail narrowed to a gorge barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, with cliff walls rising high on both sides, and an overhang of loose granite and old snowpack that he'd been watching every winter, that accumulated and shifted, and that he'd always given a wide berth to for the obvious reason. "Some hours at this pace," he said. "Maybe less if we push. And they'd have to come through it? Only way up to the crown that a horse can manage. They could go around, but that's a longer detour." He looked at her. "If they're in a hurry, and they will be, they come through the gorge." She studied the ridgeline to the north, trying to see the shape of what he was planning. "One shot," she said slowly. "At the right place, the right angle." "The overhang's been building since winter," he said. "Deep snowpack on rotten granite. I've been watching it move, just barely, but it's been moving. One solid impact in the right place on that cliff face could bring the whole thing down. Could bring the whole ridge down," he said. "It's not a precise operation." She looked at him. "But you've been thinking about it." "Since last night, yes. You've been thinking about killing men." He didn't look away. "I've been thinking about keeping you alive," he said. "And yes, that's what it means." She held his gaze and thought about Langford riding onto her father's property with his clean boots and his document. She thought about the torch the thick man had lit in their yard and the direction he'd been walking with it. She thought about her father at that kitchen table and the winter he'd spent alone while she was in the mountains, and the morning a neighbor had found him. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They reached the crown of the sky drainage by mid-morning. It was everything Asher had described, a high alpine sanctuary tucked behind the final ridge, invisible from below, a broad, flat-bottomed valley with a stream running through it, and a cirque of peaks on 3 sides that created a particular microclimate, sheltered from the worst weather. The grass here was already showing green at the stream's edge where the snowmelt had soaked through. It felt improbably gentle for this altitude, like a room in a house that always stayed warm, regardless of what the weather did outside. They left the horses picketed at the stream and went back south on foot to the gorge. Devil's Anvil was aptly named. The cliff walls were dark granite, stained with mineral lines and the permanent damp of snowmelt seeping through cracks, and they pressed close enough together at the narrowest point that the shadow between them lasted most of the day. The floor of the gorge was loose shale and old snow, still frozen solid in the shade. The overhang Asher had described was visible the moment she looked up, a massive lip of rock and compacted snow jutting out from the east cliff face. Some distance up, its underside dark with moisture, its upper edge ragged where it had been slowly failing all winter. Asher studied it for a long time without speaking. "There," he said, pointing to a section of the cliff face below the overhang, where a deep diagonal crack ran across the granite. "Impact there and the vibration goes straight up. The snow's already failing. It just needs the final argument." "And the shot?" "From the west ridge." He turned and looked up at the cliff on the opposite side of the gorge, a scramble of broken rock. "Clear angle. Some distance to that crack. Manageable." He looked at her. "I'll need you on the gorge floor." She understood immediately. "You need eyes on them. I need to know exactly when they're in position. I can't see the gorge floor from the west ridge. The angle's wrong. If I fire too early, the snow falls in front of them. Too late, it falls behind them, and we've made things worse," she finished. She looked at the gorge floor, then up at the overhang, thought about the geometry of it. "I need to be back far enough that I'm clear of the fall zone. Some distance south of the narrowest point," he said immediately. "There's a rock formation there. You've seen it coming through. 3 big boulders grouped together. You'd be protected and have a clear line of sight north into the gorge. And the signal? 2 shots from the Winchester. Fast. One after the other." He paused. "Don't wait too long. Once they're in the gorge, they'll see the overhang, and some of them will recognize what it means. If they start to pull back, I fire," she said. "And then I move. Fast," he said. "North, up the gorge, through the fall zone, before anything else comes down." He looked at her with the same expression he'd had in the cabin doorway. Managed fear, the kind that honest people carry into dangerous things because they're honest enough to know the difference between courage and the absence of fear. "It's a very tight window." "I know." "Clara, Asher." She stepped close to him and put her hand flat on his chest, feeling the solid reality of him under the layers of coat and wool. "We've been through worse than this." He put his hand over hers, held it there for a moment. "The mountain lion was worse," she continued. "The fever was worse. The first week in this place, honestly, was worse." She felt him exhale, something between a laugh and a breath. "This is just men. Men are easier than mountain lions. Men have rifles," he said. "So do I." He looked at her for another moment. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, which was not something he did often. He wasn't a demonstrative man in the ordinary run of things, and that made the moments when he was demonstrative land with the weight of things said by people who choose their words carefully. "After this," he said, "we go up to the crown. We stay there as long as we want. As long as we want, she agreed. He kissed her once, brief and firm. And then he was moving toward the west cliff face, the sharps across his back. Climbing the broken rock with the ground-covering efficiency she'd stopped being surprised by months ago. She watched him go until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she turned south to the 3 boulders, and she settled in to wait. Waiting was its own discipline. She'd learned that this winter, how to be still, how to hold yourself in a state of readiness without burning through it, how to keep your mind from running ahead to worst cases while still staying alert. Asher had taught her the first part of that, the physical stillness, the management of breath and heartbeat in cold conditions. The rest she'd arrived at herself in the long hours she'd spent alone in the cabin or on the trap lines while he ranged further out. She thought about her father while she waited. Not with the raw edge of new grief that had broken open in her the night Asher had told her, and she'd let herself feel it fully, and alone in the dark while Asher slept, which was what she needed, that privacy of grief, but with the quieter sadness of established fact. Henry Mercer had died in the winter in his sleep in the house he'd built while she was learning to shoot a Sharps rifle and falling in love with a mountain trapper some distance north. She hoped the neighbor had been good to him. She hoped he hadn't been too lonely. She hoped he had understood in those final months that she was safe. She would never know if he had. That was the thing about death. It closed questions that couldn't be reopened. She heard them before she saw them. Sound traveled strangely in the gorge, bouncing off the cliff walls and arriving from unexpected directions. And the first thing she registered was the sound of multiple horses on shale, the particular sharp ring of iron shoes on loose stone. Then voices, low and indistinct. Then the shape of the first rider emerging from the shadowed south entrance of the gorge. Langford rode first. Of course he did. That was the kind of man he was. He put himself at the front, not from courage, but from the need to be seen leading. Behind him came the thick man, and behind him several more riders she hadn't seen before. Several total. Better armed than the day before. She could see the rifle scabbards, multiple per man. She pressed herself flat against the boulder and watched through the narrow gap between 2 of the rocks. Her Winchester was across her forearms. They moved slowly through the gorge. The horses didn't like it. She could see that even from this distance, the tightness in their movement, the way their ears stayed up and rotated. Horses didn't like enclosed spaces with uncertain footing, and they didn't like the sound of their own hooves coming back at them from stone walls. The thick man looked up as they rode. She saw it happen, the moment his eyes found the overhang. He said something to Langford and pointed upward. Langford looked. Several of the men behind him looked. She could see the shape of the conversation even without hearing it. The thick man cautious, Langford dismissive. Langford was a man of ledgers and legal documents and boardrooms, and no matter how many hired guns he traveled with, he didn't have a wilderness man's instinct for what a high overhang of winter snowpack on failing granite actually meant. They kept coming. She waited, counted, watched the lead horses push deeper into the narrow section, the gorge walls closing on both sides until they were riding single file with limited clearance on each side. When Langford's horse was directly below the widest part of the overhang, she fired. 2 shots, fast, one after the other. The Winchesters cracked sharp and flat in the closed space of the gorge. For a single horrible second, nothing happened, and she thought she'd mistimed it, that Asher hadn't heard, or the angle was wrong, or the Sharp spoke from the west ridge. The sound of it was different from anything she'd heard before. Not just the boom of the rifle, but what came after. A crack that wasn't the rifle at all. A deep structural fracture that she felt in her chest more than heard. The sound of something very large and very old deciding to let go. She was already moving. North, up the gorge, running hard on the loose shale. her boots finding the frozen patches and the solid rock by luck and momentum. Behind her, she heard the snow begin, a sound that started like a whisper and built in less than seconds to something that had no good description, only the word avalanche, and the inadequacy of that word for what it actually sounded like up close, which was more like the mountain changing its mind about the arrangement of itself. She ran. The rock formation she was aiming for, the narrow section's north end where the gorge opened back out, was some distance, and she covered it with the specific motivation of a person who has a very clear understanding of what is behind them. The roar built, and the ground shook under her feet, and small stones began raining from the cliff walls, and she put her head down and ran, and did not look back. She cleared the gorge mouth and threw herself sideways behind a granite outcrop and pressed flat, and the wave of cold air hit her a second later. The displaced air pushed ahead of the snow mass, a physical force that pressed her against the rock. And then the sound peaked, an absolute overwhelming fullness of sound, and then it began to diminish. And then it was the sound of settling, of things coming to rest, of debris still pattering down from the cliff walls. Then quiet, the specific quiet of aftermath. She raised her head. The south entrance of the gorge was gone. Not blocked, gone, in the sense that the geography had rearranged itself entirely. Where there had been a passage, there was now a wall of compacted snow and granite rubble, high and wide across, its face still smoking with ice crystals and stone dust drifting in the thin spring air. She sat with her back against the outcrop and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her thighs and let them shake and breathe through it, because there was nothing to do with the shaking except let it happen. She had just done something that couldn't be undone, had been part of ending something in the most absolute way available to the world, and the shaking was the honest response to that, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Asher came down off of the west ridge some time later. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his boots on the loose rock above the gorge, deliberate and unhurried. He came around the boulder she was sitting against and stopped. He looked at the rubble wall where the gorge entrance had been. Then he looked at her. "You're all right," he said. "Not a question? A verification? The kind you make when you need to confirm something your eyes are telling you, but your chest hasn't accepted yet." "I'm all right," she said. He sat down beside her on the rock. Both of them looked at the avalanche debris for a moment. "Langford," she said. "In the gorge when it came down," he said. "All of them." She absorbed that. "He had a ledger," she said. "He told you. Men like that keep ledgers." "The ledger's closed now," Asher said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, and they sat there in the cold spring air while the last of the ice crystals drifted down from the cliff face and the silence settled back over the mountains like something returning to its proper place. She thought about what it meant, what all of it meant, not just today, but the whole of it from the beginning, from the day a man in clean boots rode onto her father's property with a document and a plan. She thought about the way that moment had looked like an ending, had felt like an ending, the kind that left you no ground left to stand on. And she thought about how endings that look total sometimes aren't. Sometimes there's a stranger at the edge of the tree line with a pouch of gold and a conscience and a carved wooden bird and years of carrying a memory he couldn't put down. She thought about what she'd been when this began. Frightened, furious, certain that she was being traded from one set of bad circumstances to another. She thought about what she was now. Not a different person. The same person, but found. That was the only word that fit. Like something she'd been missing from herself had been up here the whole time, waiting in the cold and the silence to be recovered. "I need to tell you something," she said. Asher turned his head slightly, listening. "When you sat with me on the riverbank," she said, "when I was a child, I was alone that day because I'd run away from home. Not permanently. I wasn't running anywhere in particular. I was just running because I was so angry at everything, and I didn't know where to put it. And I fell through the ice because I wasn't paying attention, and I was cold, and I was alone." She paused. "And then you were there, and you pulled me out, and you sat with me, and you gave me something small and beautiful, and you didn't ask me why I was out there alone. You didn't ask me anything. You just stayed." Asher was quiet. "I've been thinking about why I kept that sparrow for years," she said. "I thought it was because the moment was frightening, and you were kind. But I think it was something simpler than that." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You were the first person who just stayed without needing me to explain myself first. And I was a child and I didn't have a word for how much that mattered, so I kept the bird instead." He looked at her for a long moment. The scar on his face was white in the cold light, and his eyes were the dark gray she'd memorized over the course of a whole winter, and he looked like himself. Like the particular, complicated, specific human being she'd come to know better than anyone she'd ever known. With all his difficulties and his silences and his patient enormousness of heart. "I stayed," he said carefully, "because you were a kid alone in a river, and you needed someone to stay. That's all it was then. I know. It got more complicated later. I know that too," she said. "I'm not making it into something it wasn't. I'm just—" She stopped. Tried again. "I'm saying thank you for that day, and for this winter, and for all of it. I don't think I've said it plainly enough." He reached into his coat and produced the wooden sparrow, the one she'd pressed into his hand during the fever, the one he'd been carrying since. He turned it over once in his big fingers and then held it out to her. She took it. "You don't want to keep it?" she said. "I made it for you," he said. "Years ago or now, it was always for you." She closed her fingers around it. The wood was warm from his coat. They sat for a while longer on the cold rock. The spring afternoon was thinning toward evening, the light going golden and long across the high peaks. Below them somewhere was the buried gorge and what was in it. Above them was the crown of the sky and the horses at the stream, and the flat-bottomed valley that felt improbably like a place they could actually live. "The silver," she said eventually. "The land. There'll be legal questions." "Yes. Langford's people, his lawyers in Billings. Whoever he had working the surveys, they'll come looking eventually." "Eventually," Asher agreed. "Not soon, and not up here. We can't stay up here forever." "No," he said. "But we can stay for a while." He looked out at the peaks. "Long enough to figure out what we want to do with it. The land's yours legally, Langford or no Langford. A lawyer in Billings could sort it out in time." He paused. "You could sell it. Legitimately. Keep the money. Live wherever you want to live." She thought about that. The money. The freedom that kind of money could theoretically buy. A house somewhere. A real town. A life that looked like what lives were supposed to look like. She thought about it seriously. Gave it the honest consideration it deserved. Then she thought about the lake in the deep winter, with the pressure cracks in the ice spreading out in their particular pattern that only happened here, at this altitude, in this specific place, because of the spring running under the northwest corner. She thought about lying on the ice with her face pressed to the clear patch, looking at the dark water below, and Asher lying beside her saying, "I love you," like he was relieved to have finally found the words. "What do you want?" she said. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't answer immediately, didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. He actually thought about it the way he thought about everything, with that complete going still quality, reading the internal terrain. "This," he said, finally. He gestured at the mountains around them, vague and comprehensive. "I want to be here with you." A pause. "I've been here alone for years, and it was sufficient. It was what I knew, and I was good at it, and I told myself it was enough." He stopped. "It wasn't enough. I know that now. But the place isn't the problem. "The place is fine." He looked at her. "I just want the rest of it to be different." "The rest of it is different," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She stood up and brushed the granite dust off her coat. Her legs were stiff from the sitting, and from the running, and from the accumulated strain of a day that had required more from her body and her nerve than she'd fully acknowledged while it was happening. She was going to be sore tomorrow. That was fine. She'd been sore before. She put out her hand. He took it and stood, and they walked together toward the horses, up the rocky slope toward the crown of the sky, into the long gold light of the spring evening. There was something she understood now that she hadn't understood when this began. Standing in frozen mud, watching Langford ride onto her father's property, she thought then that life was something that happened to you, that the shape of it was determined by the forces pressing in from outside, by debt and drought, and men with documents and clean boots. She thought that the best you could do was endure what came and try to keep yourself intact inside it. She knew better now. Life wasn't what pressed in from outside. It was what you chose to become under pressure. It was what the winter made of you when the winter had been brutal enough to show you what you were actually made of. It was the fire that got built, and the traps that got checked, and the sparrow that stayed in your pocket for years, because something in you understood its value, even when you had no words for what that value was. It was the man whose hand was rough and warm in hers, who had been carrying his own version of that sparrow for all the same years, who had come down out of the wilderness for her without any guarantee that she'd be anything other than frightened of him forever. Imperfect. Both of them. Shaped wrong by hard things in ways they'd never fully unshape. But here, together, choosing this. The horses were where they'd left them, drinking at the snowmelt stream in the last of the evening light. The dun stallion raised its head when Asher approached and made the low sound in its chest that horses make for people they trust. Asher put his hand on its neck the way he always did, automatic and gentle, and the horse dropped its head back to the water. Clara looked out at the crown of the sky in the fading light. The peaks were going rose and copper in the sunset, the snow on their faces catching the color and holding it. The stream ran over its stones with a sound that was the same sound water had been making in this valley for ages before any human being had stood here to hear it. It was very beautiful. It was also cold and getting colder, and they needed to make camp before dark. And the horses needed to be properly picketed, and she was hungry in the serious way of someone who had run a considerable distance under significant stress. "We need wood," she said. "There's deadfall by the east drainage," Asher said. "Food? I've got dried venison and hardtack and about some coffee." "That's not much. We'll hunt tomorrow." He glanced at her. "Unless you have a better idea." "My ideas are mostly centered on the coffee right now," she said. The almost smile, the one she'd catalogued before, that barely there shift at the corner of his mouth that she'd come to read as clearly as a shout from anyone else. "I'll get wood," he said. "I'll make camp," she said. They split without discussion, each moving to their part of the work, which was what they did, had been doing for months now. The particular fluency of two people who had learned each other's rhythms well enough to function as a single organism when the situation required it. The fire was going by the time Asher came back with the wood. She'd made a windbreak with the canvas and gotten the bedrolls arranged and found a flat stone to set the coffee pot on. He added wood to what she'd started and settled it down to a good steady burn and filled the pot from the stream. They sat across from the fire and ate what they had and drank the coffee when it was ready. And neither of them spoke much because there was no particular need to, which was its own kind of wealth, the kind you couldn't find in a silver deposit or a legal deed, the kind that took a whole hard winter to accumulate. Above them, the stars came out over the mountains, more of them than you could see at lower elevations, a density of light that always faintly stunned her, even into living under it. She reached into her pocket and took out the sparrow, held it in her palm in the firelight. The pale wood, the carefully folded wings, the head tilted as if listening. She'd held it in the same way 1,000 times over years, and she was only now understanding all the things it had been holding for her, not just the memory of that afternoon on the riverbank, but everything that afternoon had been the beginning of. The long loop of it, the specific, improbable, unlikely way that one scared boy's instinct to be decent to a drowning child, had eventually brought two people together in the middle of a mountain winter and made something real and permanent out of a gesture and a piece of pale wood. She looked up and found Asher watching her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Sparrows," she said. He looked at the carving in her hand. Then he looked at her face. He had always been better at reading her face than she expected for a man who claimed not to be good at anything that was about other people. "It worked out," he said. She closed her fingers around the sparrow. "Yes," she said. It did. The fire burned. The stream ran. The mountains stood in the dark around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the same as they had always been and would always be, long after everything human in this valley had been forgotten. And two imperfect, complicated, hard-edged people sat beside a fire in the wilderness and were simply and completely exactly where they had chosen to be. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.